Hello and welcome to today's lesson on the uses of radiation, which is part of the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science Physics. So in today's lesson we're going to look at the uses of radiation. So if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we should be able to state the basic properties of radioactive decay, look at the uses of radioactivity in the real world, and explain how the different uses of radioactivity work, which falls into the following part of the AQA GCSE Physics specification. 4.4.2.1 Radioactive Decay and Nuclear Radiation, in particular the section which states students should be able to apply their knowledge to the uses of radiation and evaluate the best source of radiation to use in a given situation. Now, radioactive emissions can be used to carry out many different jobs in our modern world, and we use the three different types of radioactive emissions for different jobs in the real world. Now, we do this as we can use the properties of radioactive emissions which we've looked at before to our advantage to do various jobs. So different uses of radioactive emissions include smoke alarms, thickness control, sterilization, dating materials, tracers, and quality control. Now, how does each one work? Okay, and in addition to that, we've also got radiotherapy. So we're now going to recap how each task uses radioactive emissions. So let's look at thickness control. Now, in thickness control, what you're looking at is trying to work out how thick a material should be. Now, in most cases, this will be a sheet of metal. Now, in thickness control, the amount of radiation passing through the foil or the metal depends on the thickness of the foil. Now, we use for this particular example of aluminium, we use beta radiation, because if the thickness of the foil or metal increases too much, the reading on the detector will drop and the sensor then adjusts the roller to make the material thinner, so as a result more radiation passes through. So this keeps your material thickness of your metal sheet constant. Now, it's also true it's the other way around, because if the amount of beta radiation passing through the foil depends on the thickness of foil, this means if the thickness of the foil decreases too much, the foil becomes too thin, well, the detector reading then increases. So the sensor then adjusts the roller to make the material thicker so less radiation passes through, and this keeps the material constant. Now, when we're looking at the thickness of metals, we've got to use beta radiation, because alpha radiation cannot be used, as the alpha radiation will be stopped regardless of the metal thickness, and gamma radiation could not be used as the level of radiation will be unaltered by the thickness of this metal material. But if we're going to look at the thickness of paper, we're going to have to use alpha particles and not beta particles, because alpha particles will be stopped if the paper was too thick, but will pass through if the paper was too thin. Now, another use of radiation is in a smoke alarm. Now, in smoke detectors, an alpha radiation by a source is emitted from one side of the alarm to the other side, and this causes a current flow. Now, this occurs as the alpha particles ionize the air particles in the gap of the alarm, so there's a current across the gap in the circuit of the alarm. Now, normally alpha particles travel across from one side to the other side, and this does not set off the smoke alarm circuit. Now, if smoke particles get inside the alarm, the alpha particles cannot travel across the alarm, as the alpha particles ionize the smoke particles. This stops the current from being produced and the alarm goes off. Now, interestingly enough, this effect can be replicated by deodorant can spray, which is why if you spray deodorant very close to a smoke detector, it can actually set off the alarm. Now, beta particles and gamma rays cannot be used in a smoke detector, as they would firstly not ionize the air particles, and secondly, they would not ionize the smoke particles either. So as a result, it would not work on either methodologies. Now, this is because beta and gamma emissions have a much lower ionizing power than alpha particles. But remember, alpha particles are safe to use in a smoke alarm, as the alpha particles are kept far away from humans and they can only travel 5 centimeters in the air. And also, alpha particles are safe to use because the alpha particles are easy to stop and will be stopped by the plastic casing of the smoke alarm. Now, you've got to remember that if you want to use an alpha source in a smoke detector, you must use a a source which has a very long half-life, as it means the source does not need to be replaced as often, and secondly, it means the intensity of the source does not lower quickly, as this would set the alarm off. Now, another example of use in radioactive emissions is in quality control. So to check a material for any crack, a film is placed on one side of the material and a source emitting beta particles is placed on the other side of the material. Now, if there was no crack in a material, the beta radiation is emitted from a source. The beta radiation would not be stopped by a metal, so it would not show up on the film, so it will be stopped by that metal. But if there was a crack, the beta particles go through the gap without stopping, and this shows up on the film on the other side. So just to clarify, if there are no cracks in the material, the beta radiation will be stopped by the metal and would not show up on the film on the other side. But if there was a crack in the material, the beta particles go through the gap without being stopped, and therefore it shows up on the film. It causes the film to darken, so therefore you can work out where the cracks in the material are. Now, alpha particles could not be used as they'd be stopped by the air, so none would get to the other side, and gamma radiation would not be used because it will pass through the material, so it would show up on the film regardless, so you could not work out where the cracks in the material were. Now, another use of radiation is in sterilization. Now, in sterilization, gamma rays are fired at the source, and this kills off any microbes on an object by ionization. Now, this firing of radiation at a source, so it passes through the source, is an example of irradiation. Now, this prevents an object from causing an infection to a patient, so we can sterilize things like syringes and surgical instruments via this methodology. But we can also use this in supermarkets to keep food fresh for longer, because it kills off any microbes on fruit or vegetables and stops them from decaying. Now, in addition, the higher the dose of gamma radiation, the greater the amount of ionization. Now, gamma radiation also destroys the cells of the microbes on your particular instrument or on your food. Now, this is the same process as radiotherapy, but in radiotherapy, it's cancer cells which are being destroyed. Now, another use of radiation is in dating particular objects, working out how old things are. Now, half-lives of particular radioisotopes can be very important. So, for example, the radioisotope carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years, which we approximate to 5,700 years, and this is used in carbon dating to work out the age of various fossils. So, when a living organism is alive, it takes in as much carbon as it releases due to the carbon cycle. Now, the process by which carbon moves around the natural world is called the carbon cycle, and we cover that in GCSE biology. So an example, a carbon movement for a tree would be the tree takes in carbon via photosynthesis and it releases carbon via respiration and decay. Now, some of the carbon moved around in this cycle will be the radioactive isotope carbon-14. Now, this is because isotopes share the same chemical properties as they have the same number of electrons. Now, carbon-14 and carbon-12 have the same identical carbon properties as they have the same number of outer shell electrons. So this means they can be used by the tree in the same fashion. So to a tree, it doesn't matter if it's carbon-12 or it's carbon-14. It's all carbon to a tree. Now, when the living organism, such as the tree, dies, then carbon is no longer taken up by the organism. Now, in theory, carbon will still be released by the organism due to decay, but we'll assume the level of carbon is fixed in the organism. Now, if we assume that the level of carbon atoms is fixed and we don't account for the loss of carbon atoms due to decay, which we would at A-level physics, well, then we can look at how many of these carbon atoms will decay into more stable isotopes, because this radioactive isotope carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-15 by beta decay. Now, because we're changing the element, it's an example of transmutation. So what we do is we look at how many radioactive carbon-14 nuclei are in the dead organism, we compare it to how many radioactive carbon-14 isotopes are found in an equivalent living organism, and we can work out the difference between the two. Now, the alive organism will have more radioactive carbon isotopes as it's still taking up carbon, including carbon-14, because it's alive. So at that point, we can compare this to how many radioisotopes remain in the dead organism, and therefore we can work out how many half-lives have taken place for those number of carbon-14 to decay out of the dead organism. So we can calculate how many radioactive nuclei have decayed, and we know that the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, and we can then work out how long it's been since the organism died and stopped taking up carbon-14, okay, in its living processes. So this dating the organism by how much carbon it has is called carbon dating. Now we can also look at the idea of other substances doing this, because this only works on organic matter, because for carbon dating to work, as the name suggests, the substance must contain carbon. Now igneous rocks do not contain any organic matter such as carbon, so an alternative to carbon dating is uranium dating. So this is measuring the decay of uranium into lead and is used for dating non-organic matter. Now it's important to note that for carbon dating to work, or for uranium dating to work, the substance must contain some radioactive carbon isotopes or uranium isotopes in its structure to measure. This means we can't use it on a material which died a very long time ago, because all of those radioactive isotopes will have decayed into the stable isotopes by this point. And in addition, it means that it's very difficult to date organisms which have recently died, since there's not a major difference in the levels of carbon-14 in the living matter and the dead organic matter which we are comparing. So you can use the half-life of radioactive isotopes to work out when an organism stopped living. Now when we date an organism from how much radioactive carbon it has, we call that carbon dating. So what you do is you measure how much of the radioactive carbon isotope is in a living organism, you measure how much of the radioactive carbon isotope is found in the equivalent dead organism. We can then determine how much radioactive carbon has decayed and become stable over time. Now we do assume no carbon gets lost out of the organism over time, and then as a result we use the half-life of the carbon radioisotope to work out how much time must have elapsed for this amount of decay to take place. Now we can only use this method if there's a measurable difference in the carbon radioisotope between the living and dead organism, and we can't use this method if there's not been a long enough time for a noticeable difference to form. Now in addition, we can't use this method if there's not any radioactive carbon isotopes in the dead organism to form a comparison with the living organism. So we can use radioactive decay to measure the age of materials. So you've got carbon dating, which is used to find the age of wood in organic matter. Now all organic matter contains a tiny amount of radioactive carbon, which has a half-life of about 5,700 years. Now when an organism dies, it no longer absorbs carbon, so the amount of radioactive carbon decreases. Now to find the age of matter, you measure the count rate of the dead matter and the count rate of the living matter and compare. We also use uranium dating to find the age of igneous rocks. Now these rocks contain radioactive uranium, which has a half-life of 4,500 years. Each uranium nuclei decays into lead, and we can work out the age of a sample by measuring the number of nuclei of uranium in lead and comparing the two. So let's summarize what we've looked at in today's lesson. We should hopefully have a required knowledge of the properties of alpha particles, beta particles and gamma rays, which is limited to their penetration through materials, their range in air and their ionizing power. And you should be able to apply your knowledge of these radiations to understand when we use them in different situations. So if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we should be able to state the basic properties of radioactive decay, look at the uses of radioactivity in the real world, and explain how the different uses of radioactivity work. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on the uses of radioactivity found in the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science Physics. Thank you very much for listening and have a lovely day.